Dzień dobry Państwu. Witamy bardzo
Good
serdecznie na
afternoon,
konferencji
ladies and
prasowej
gentlemen.
po
Welcome
posiedzeniu
to
Rady
the
Polityki Pieniężnej.
press conference after
W
the
dzisiejszej konferencji udział brał pan
MPC
profesor
session with the
Adam
participation of
Glapiński,
Professor
Banku Polskiego,
Adam
przewodniczący
Glapiński,
Rady Polityki Pieniężnej,
Governor of the National Bank of Poland, and
profesor
MPC
Rafał
Chair,
i pan profesor
and
Jerzy Żyżyński.
Professor Leszna Ancyparowicz, Professor Jerzy Żyżyński. Over to you, Professor. Information from the meeting of the Monetary Policy Council held on the 1st and 2nd of October 2019. The Council decided to keep the NBP interest rates unchanged. Reference rate at 1.5%, lombard rate at 2.5%, deposit rate at 0.5%, rediscount rate at 1.75%. Incoming data suggest that global economic growth remains relatively low, with the global outlook deteriorating further. In the euro area, economic growth remains low against the backdrop of a downturn in industry. Still favorable situation in the service sector is the factor mitigating the scale of the slowdown. In the United States, economic conditions continue to be strong, even though economic indicators signal a weakening of activity in Q3 2019. In China, incoming data point to further weakening of the GDP growth. In September, global oil prices rose, yet remained below the level recorded a year ago. At the same time, inflation in many countries remains moderate. The European Central Bank significantly loosened its monetary policy, lowering the deposit rate further below zero, and announcing the resumption of the asset purchase program, as well as relaxing the terms of long-term refinancing operations. The ECB also signaled that the interest rates are likely to stay at the present or lower level in the subsequent quarters. The Federal Reserve also loosened its monetary policy by cutting interest rates again. In Poland, economic conditions remain good. At the same time, incoming data point to a possible decrease in the economic growth rate in Q3 2019, which is driven mainly by the economic downturn abroad. Rising consumption fueled by the increasing employment and wages, very strong consumer confidence and social benefit payments exert a stabilizing influence on GDP growth. Investment in the economy also continues to rise. Inflation in September, according to the GUS flash estimate, stood at 2.5% year-on-year. Higher price growth is primarily driven by a previous marked increase in food prices, while lower energy prices than a year ago, including fuel prices, have a curbing effect on price growth. At the same time, core inflation continues to run at moderate levels. In the Council's assessment, the outlook for economic conditions in Poland remains favorable, and GDP growth, despite the expected decline, will continue at a relatively high level in the coming years. However, uncertainty about the scale and persistence of this slowdown abroad and its impact on domestic economic activity has increased. Inflation, after a temporary rise in Q1 2020, will stay close to the target in the monetary policy transmission horizon. The Council judges that the current level of interest rates is conducive to keeping the Polish economy on a sustainable growth path and maintaining macroeconomic stability. Thank you. Thank you very much, Governor. Please, you can ask your questions. Good afternoon. I'd like to ask how deep an economic downturn we can expect. Fitch has lowered the forecasts for Poland from 4.2 to 4.1 this year and in the next year. External threats increase the German PMI, Polish PMI. Indices are very weak. What can it look like? And is it conducive to not to loosen the economic situation. Well, the global situation, as well as in our neighboring countries, is indeed in such a way that there's a significant economic downturn. In Germany, we're probably facing a recession. In the euro area, we're at very low levels, you could say. There is a sort of a stagnation. It goes without saying that the economic cycle is growing weaker. Whether it's going to lead to a recession, it's hard to say. The PMIs are indeed rather weak. However, in Poland, to some surprise of ours, the Polish economy has been responding to this in a weaker way than in the previous periods, and the general economic situation, if we were to summarize it in one sentence, is very good. We expect a GDP growth in 2019 at the level of ultimately of 4.3% year-on-year, which is lower than previously forecast, but it's still a very decent growth against the backdrop of Europe, against the global backdrop, against the OECD backdrop. Likewise, also inflation, as we expect, will be low this year, and the CPI forecast for 2012 will be at the level of 3, which is almost at our inflationary target, which is a success story because we are actually meeting our inflation target. So as you take a look at the entire year, the situation is splendid and all the indices are great. At the beginning of next year, we obviously expect a slight slowdown, an increase of inflation, and halfway through the year, again, returning towards the inflation target. Good afternoon, Rafał Tuszyński, Polish Press Agency, Economic Office. I'd like to ask you about what we asked about the elephant in the room, which is the Swiss franc verdict of the European Court of Justice. We don't know what the verdict might be. It might increase, be conducive to some forex rate volatility. And you know very well what our communication policy is. We don't talk about forex rates, and we won't be doing so. The European Court of Justice's verdict, it will be soon, but it will be tomorrow. Then it will be analyzable to a greater degree because every detail is significant. Of course, it has been the subject of the interest of our analysts, as well as the committee, macro committee that I chair as the National Bank of Poland, and likewise instructions, guidelines, recommendations have been issued that prepare it for us. But as for the details, we will be able to discuss them only tomorrow, and probably the first body to discuss it will be the Financial Supervision Authority. And what are the recommendations? So that was everything that related to the equity base of banks. Of course, a lot has been changing within the banks. The banks also prepared for this. There were all sorts of contracts. The National Bank of Poland does not talk about the individual banks. The National Bank is only responsible for the stability of the entire banking system. It's the FSA that is responsible for the individual banks, and also the Ministry of Finance on the micro scale. We are involved, however, we only have the reading role at the macro level, and we don't expect any negative scenario. Coming back to the forex rate, over the last quarter, the Polish zloty has decreased by about 3%, and the fact that there has been no standpoint, no position from the FSA and the National Bank of Poland might have been conducive to that decrease. Hasn't there been any communication mistake? Well, the whole situation will end tomorrow morning, and whether the market relaxes or rebounds, we don't know. It's hard to speculate. Nothing worrying can be observed, and FX rate fluctuations are only normal, especially in the case of a currency which is not subject to intervention, and it floats freely in the market.
Przepraszam, pani redaktor,
Can I?
i oddamy pani głos za chwilkę.
Dorota Bartyzel, Bloomberg News.
Governor, to relate to that, you said you don't expect a negative scenario. This is probably unlike most of observers, or maybe even participants of the market and generally observers of the banking system. What could be a negative scenario that you don't expect? If I'm saying that I'm not expecting any negative scenario, I'm not even pondering what the negative scenarios could be. Well, we've known that there would be a verdict like this, and I see nothing concerning about this. Mind you that this will be a verdict that will probably relate to only part of currency loans, not of all the banks. There are all sorts of contracts, and it will be subject to the decisions of Polish courts that will be investigating each case on an individual basis, and it will be spread over time. Well, it's the responses, market responses are natural. Well, as for the observers, I beg your pardon, you probably mean professional observers or some internal analyses along with journalists who obviously look for some headlines and some events that can be fit as headlines, but in the internal analyses we don't see any concerning issues. So for what you said, you mean the internal analyses of the National Bank of Poland, of internal analyses of all the analyzing bodies, though it stems, and it's different for headlines in the press, but the response, the very word, suggests that to be responsive means that you don't take too much time to the position that you will be taking. And psychology, as we know in the markets and for the markets, often goes the furthest way. The markets know what the possibilities, the capabilities of our market is, and what the condition of the banking system in Poland is. It is exceptionally good. The entire banking system in Poland is very stable, very well equipped in terms of equity, and throughout the whole year, all the ratios have been increased in line with the Financial Stability Committee's recommendations, in line with what the Polish FSA has been doing. And from the point of view of the banking system stability, that the National Bank of Poland is especially responsible, we don't see any reasons to worry. Let me come back to our core business, which is the monetary policy. Given the fact that even in your information from the meeting, you mentioned that the risk of both stability and the duration and the depth of the economic downturn in Europe, in European economy and global, also in emerging markets, and its impact on Poland's economy. Well, this is a ratio for 1 month, but inflation is slightly more under control. At the same time, you expect for it to be to hit the target next year. Can we say from today's perspective that the issue of restricting the monetary policy is much less probable than loosening? Well, it has never been probable during my term. Never? No, you said that it is not probable anymore. It has never been. You said, since I've been here, we've never considered restricting or loosening. It's never been probable. There have never been opinions, overriding opinions this way or another. Most MPC members have favored the stabilization of interest rates, which is still taking place, and this mostly reflected the situation of the Polish economy and finance, and it's been stabilizing. It's still stabilizing. And now, as for the arguments, well, the arguments are getting less to increase the interest rates as the economic downturn is growing, but the number of arguments in terms of loosening is growing. Well, not in my view, and hopefully also in the downturn, global downturn will not be deepening. Well, we can see that all the banks have loosened their monetary policy, but right now the discussion in Europe and globally is about fiscal policy. Now that they have zero interest rates or even negative interest rates, then very quickly the non-conventional policy is being reconstructed, even though the ECB wanted to not to resort to non-conventional policy. It's coming back to asset purchase, likewise in the Federal Reserve, but it's not unanimous. Both at the ECB and the Federal Reserve, it has all these votes have not been unanimous. The situation is not clear enough. Some of the members of the decision-making bodies were against it. There's even been one resignation. So it's not so clear, but the majority of the banks, excepting the Norwegian bank, which is quite specific, have loosened their monetary policy and are facing the dilemma of whether it's sufficient or whether you shouldn't pass on to the fiscal policy. Mind you that in our case, there have been also a number of smart actions that maintain the economic cycle. We don't have a dark downturn. It's both the social disbursements as Family 500 Plus and the decrease in taxation. It is stimulating in terms of the economic cycle, but we don't have to sustain anything or increase, because given the growth rate, GDP growth rate above the natural interest rates, as the economists call it, I'm an economist that doesn't believe it's meaningful, but it is universally believed that there's a natural GDP growth. We're above it. So that's a very decent growth rate, and if that growth rate is maintained in the next years, then we could expect a moment when the economic cycle goes up in the West again, and we will be moving towards 5%. Well, it's 3.5 rather. Mr. Governor, I'd like to come back for a moment to the European Court of Justice's verdict. You said you don't expect any worst-case scenario, but as we know, there have been estimates of losses in the sector. That's what I referred to the press, because I also review the press every day. But they are different. They range from 15 even, to 60 billion zlotys. Some of them, for some reason, cover all currency loans, and we know that the decision will be only on the indexed rates. Well, it will be spread over years. You know how courts consider all individual cases or bundles of cases, but you know that those pending cases, well, I don't know how many there are, but their number has grown significantly over the last couple of months. They will still be, the court verdicts will be made. Well, mind you that this is not mandatory to Polish courts. It's like guidance, and Polish courts are independent, and they will decide on an individual basis, and each case will be individual. And leaving European Court of Justice aside, well, so far a majority of the verdicts have been in line with the bank's expectations. Coming back to the economic cycle, if the global economic downturn is lasting, no one can expect how deep it will be and how long it will take. Yes, we are not aware of this. Then the National Bank of Poland, is it preparing any tools that might prove necessary? As you will remember, after the 2007-8 crisis, when I assumed office, along with the MPC, we reviewed all the instruments of the monetary policy that the Council had in line with the assumptions assumed by the European legislator, and we decided that we didn't need to include anything else because we have all the instruments in our toolbox. They have not been used so far. They're covered in dust, and I think they will still be covered in dust because we're very far removed from the situation that our colleagues from Western Europe have. They have a different situation. Our growth is much higher. Our interest rates are way higher. They're nominally at the highest level, probably the highest level in Europe, the nominal ones. So we have all the traditional tools which can still be used. We have all our traditional conventional tools are ready, up and ready, and we don't need to use anything unconventional. Well, that's like quantitative easing is something that I'm quite skeptical of, as well as some of the central bank governors that meet in Basel are quite skeptical of it. On the other hand, some others are ready to reach for them. That's where the discussion is going on. If I were there, I don't know what I would be favoring, because the societies, the parliaments expect that, well, since the living conditions are good, and our salaries grow at the level of 7%, so the purchasing power is still very high. So we sometimes smile when we just read that the prices are high, even the headlines. Well, the prices are high when the purchasing power of the society is decreasing, and still our salaries grow at a higher rate than vegetables or meat, or we're talking about the entire basket. So we have no situation where the prices are drastically high, and nothing like this will happen. That's why we have the National Bank of Poland to take care of this.
So let's go back to your fiscal policy and the policy mix in Poland. Does the Council think that the current policy mix, so stabilization of interest rates and sustainable budget for the next year plus increasing social spendings, is it an optimum mix for the Polish economy? So maybe the fiscal policy should be sort of stepping in, as some politicians in the West are saying. Well, I don't think we should be now reviewing and commenting on the government's policy. Well, but we can ask you. Well, when it comes to our fiscal policy, well, there was this announcement that our budget is pretty balanced, pretty sustainable, and we should be happy about it. We're not getting in more in debt. We need less debt, and the structure of our public debt has changed in favor of us, because most of our public debt, a vast majority of it, is actually concentrated among our residents. So in the Polish zlotys, maybe not residents, the structure is a little bit different, but anyway, the threat that at one point someone is going to play with exchange rates, well, this risk has gone away. And so we have low interest rates, so profitability. So actually servicing this debt is cheap for us. We're getting money at a cheap price. When it comes to fiscal policy, if one could say anything, one should say rather positive things, because this fiscal policy is based on this very traditional function of our budget, namely redistribution. We don't have fiscal loosening to intervene, but we have a different, a changed structure. And now it goes towards redistribution, common good. So I believe that this scenario, a scenario to grow our economy this way, it's very positive compared to other countries, because that's the approach to budget policy. Certain groups of people who used to be marginalized or restricted in their consumption have received a chance, but not at the expense of higher public debt. They have received a chance to be able to consume more, and this led to better sentiments, more positive sentiments. So all our surveys, results of surveys among households the results are very positive. So I believe that our monetary policy, well, it is very sustainable, transparent, predictable, and this is indirectly linked to the fiscal policy that's being implemented. So I don't see threats. We should, quite the opposite, we should be happy to see our economy growing without any tensions from the outside or from the inside. Also, the situation, our international situation is also stable. Rating agencies are not concerned about us. No one is concerned about us. Professor Brzeziński, let me also point out what's been already said. Let me reiterate that fiscal policy is one of stimulating demand, but it's not increasing deficit. So there was an announcement about the fact that we're going to have a very sustainable budget, so the NBP doesn't need to stimulate the demand side anymore. Especially the inflation is very close to the target, so the biggest value that we should try and protect is stabilization of our monetary situation. We have analyzed the budget. We have looked at it quite closely, I'd have to say, but well, the elections are coming, and after the elections we'll have new government formed, and we'll have another draft budget, and it will be, of course, presented to us. Then we will present our opinion, and it will go to the parliament. But generally, I'd say yes, the budget being sustainable is very real, especially that the open pension funds have been modified, and the social security has been reformed. So what about, is there less pressure on you to loosen monetary policy and to keep rates stable, or maybe a slowdown outside of this country would make this pressure higher? Well, let me just say we are very, very far from doing anything to stimulate or loosen something or anything like that. The situation is very good. If the present situation continues into the next year and the following years, then we should be all but thankful, and we shouldn't do anything about it. So right now, nominally, our interest rates are positive, on the positive side, so there's still room to maneuver, but I don't think anything will happen to make us want to use this room to maneuver, especially that, well, this downturn in Germany hasn't yet shifted onto us. We're doing rather well. If there is a further slowdown in Germany, again, it will still not become a reason for us to do anything. And let me reiterate what I've already said, and at a certain point in time you were even smiling slyly, but it is probable that till the end of my term or the terms of my colleagues on the council, we will keep the interest rates. We will have kept them, and not because we want to spite anyone who thinks the opposite, but simply all signs indicate that that's a sound policy. Of course, within the council there might be some, let's say, different opinions because certain people have subscribe to certain schools of thought or they have different personal views, but actually all our views are very well balanced, and we're actually always getting back into the mainstream, so to speak, represented by the majority of the Monetary Policy Council. Same things for Fed and the ECB.
Pani redaktor Bartyzel, bardzo proszę.
Conservatism, in a good sense, is prevailing. Right. I am smiling, but not slyly or I'm not trying to spite anyone. But anyway, I would like to maybe add a macroeconomic element. You, Governor, presented some forecasts today that are quite new, like 4.3 GDP, 4.3 this year. So is it coming from monthly adjustments, coming from experts? Well, we are doing things as we go, as the situation changes, but remember, November is approaching, and then we'll have something more binding, let's say. We're looking at this flash estimate for September. Let us wait. But in November, we'll know more. You were very much interested in the minimum wage and everything around it. I always tell you what we think, what we believe should happen. So of course, there are some forecasts, then adjustments, then further analysis. It always takes time. And what about your optimism around the notion of inflation? Am I optimistic? Is it optimism? Well, this optimism comes from the fact that we have a certain downturn all around the world. So I'm not, well, if the whole world around us was developing, I would be even more optimistic. I'm not happy about recession in Germany, because recession in Germany will affect our economy. Well, have you learned about the secrets, about the secret behind prices of energy for the coming year, because we are to expect a surprise. So what are you assuming that the government would do? Well, we are cautious, we are prudent, and our model for the next year, I cannot disclose too much, we're assuming, let's say, some conservative levels. Do you remember last time we were making an assumption about the pace of increase of energy prices? 8%, but actually there was a drop rather than an increase. So we should be more conservative in our estimates, not to be overly optimistic. What about inflation for 2019? You're expecting 2.3. Then in the first quarter next year, an increase, and then towards the middle of next year, we should go down back to the target. And all those indicators always are linked to the core, right? So when you're looking at what's happening with the core level, then you can make some estimates. And all the other things, of course, are indicated by what's happening in real life. But, you know, monthly inflation is, well, 0. But according to the flash estimate, it's even negative. But again, it was a very quick estimate, a flash estimate. But between between August and September, it was 0. Where we are simply taking the estimates from the Central Statistical Office in good faith. We're not trying to challenge it, and they definitely are part of a European system, and definitely our Central Statistical Office, I'm going to defend it. It's a wonderful institution across all central statistical offices in Europe, especially those that are under Eurostat, things are changing, methodologies are changing, shifting, consumption baskets are changing. But again, we're not doubting them and their estimates. Anyone who accuses the Central Statistical Office, well, some politicians were even accusing this office for making some falsified or false estimates, but actually it's unfounded. They have a very thorough methodology. Madam Anceparowicz, Professor Anceparowicz, she knows very well how they are working. Well, between the years 1993 and 2011, I was even very closely linked to this institution. I know how they work. Definitely, at one point we were telling you this about investment, how to measure, because we feel that because of leasing, certain amount of investment is sort of eaten away from our estimates because companies simply prefer to lease. But anyway, still, this is something that is very difficult to measure statistically because there's different kinds of leasing services and mechanisms. Right. Thank you so much for today.